Welcome to Things You Don't Know. Today, we're dealing with one of the darkest episodes in American history and perhaps in international history too. It's called the Trail of Tears. And I want to make clear from the beginning that this was not simply a tragic journey in which people happened to die. It was a result of government policy. Native people were pressured, deceived, dispossessed, imprisoned, and ultimately forced from lands their families had occupied for generations. The numbers alone are staggering. During the broader era of Indian removal, roughly 100,000 Native Americans were forced west of the Mississippi. Thousands died. In the Cherokee removal of 1838 and 1839, more than 16,000 people were driven from their homeland, and a traditional estimate is that roughly 4,000 died as a consequence of removal. I think that number is too low from everything that I've been able to determine. In the camps, on the journey, or from its immediate effects.
And there's another point that needs to be established immediately, Dr. Weaver. The phrase Trail of Tears is most closely associated with the Cherokee removal, but the Cherokee were not the only native nation expelled from the southeast. The federal government removed approximately 21,000 Muskogee Creek, 16,000 Cherokee, 9,000 Choctaw, 6,000 Chickasaw, and 4,000 Seminole during this terrible era.
So we're not just talking about a wagon train that went badly here. We're talking about a policy designed to clear native people from valuable land so that other Americans could just come in and occupy it, take it over. And behind that policy was not only greed, there was an unmistakable racial assumption that white civilization had a stronger claim to the land and to the future than to the people already living there.
One of the great contradictions of this story is that removal advocates repeatedly portrayed Native Americans totally unjustly as uncivilized people incapable of adapting to the United States. Yet the Cherokee alone had gone to extraordinary lengths to demonstrate exactly the opposite. They farmed, they operated businesses, they established schools. Sequoyah invented the Cherokee syllabary, making written Cherokee language possible. The Cherokee Phoenix became a newspaper printed in both Cherokee and English. And in 1827, the Cherokee Nation adopted a written constitution establishing a republican form of government. Some were even slaveholders.
Yeah, which creates an uncomfortable question here. White leaders often claim that Native people had to adopt European American ways if they wanted to survive. The Cherokee adopted many of those ways and then discovered that it didn't protect them. Georgia began passing laws designed to destroy Cherokee sovereignty. Cherokee citizens could not conduct their government normally. They were restricted from mining gold on their own land. They could be prevented from meeting in council, and Cherokee testimony against whites was excluded in Georgia courts.
Can you imagine that? Yeah, it was excluded. They couldn't testify.
I think it's sick.
So the issue wasn't really, will Native Americans assimilate enough? For many white Americans, the answer had become, we want the land. And once that becomes the real objective, almost anything can be rationalized. We have to talk directly about racial prejudice because it wasn't incidental to removal. It helped make removal politically possible. Andrew Jackson, repeatedly described Native societies in language that assumed white superiority. In his 1830 message to Congress, he contrasted a growing white population with what he called a few savage hunters. He referred to Native institutions as rude and spoke of Native people eventually casting off their savage habits. Those are not neutral descriptions of a disagreement over jurisdiction. They reveal a hierarchy. White, Christian, agricultural society was treated as advanced. Native society was treated as backward.
Jackson wasn't inventing that prejudice, my friends. Anti native attitudes went back generations, and settlers, state politicians, land speculators, and others had powerful economic reasons to encourage them. But Jackson gave removal the full weight of his presidency, and the timing mattered. Gold was discovered in northern Georgia in the late 1820s on Cherokee land. Suddenly, the pressure to get the Cherokee out at all costs became even more intense.
And that's what makes the rhetoric about helping native people so difficult to accept. What's really appalling here is that the government frequently tried to present this removal as humanitarian, as though Native American people were being rescued from extinction. Yeah, right. But somehow this supposedly benevolent policy also had the convenient effect of transferring millions of acres to white settlement. When prejudice and profit point in the same direction, then somehow morality tends to lose very quickly.
In 1830, Congress considered the Indian Removal Act. It was not universally supported. The opposition Whig Party led great protests against it. This wasn't something every American just casually accepted. The Senate passed the Act 28 to 19. The House passed it 102 to 97. 5 votes in the House separated the passage from defeat. President Jackson signed it on May 28, 1830. Just let me mention very briefly, friends, very prominent leaders at the time resigned from Congress because of it, including the famous frontiersman Davy Crockett.
That's worth emphasizing. There were Americans at the time who understood what was happening. Churches, missionaries, politicians, newspaper editors, and ordinary citizens protested removal. Thousands signed petitions. So we shouldn't excuse it by saying, well, everybody thought that way then. Everybody didn't. There were people in 1830, thank God, saying this was wrong.
And the law was phrased in terms of negotiated exchanges. That sounds very different from soldiers surrounding houses. But once native nations refused to voluntarily surrender their homelands, the difference between negotiation and coercion became increasingly thin.
How did the Cherokee respond? Not with violence. They did something remarkably American. They hired an army of lawyers and went to court. Their struggle eventually led to Westchester versus Georgia in 1832, one of the most important decisions on native sovereignty in the history of the Supreme Court. Chief Justice John Marshall's court ruled that Georgia could not simply impose its laws inside what he called sovereign Cherokee territory. The Cherokee Nation possessed political rights granted for its service in the War of 1812 that Georgia could not erase merely because the state and white speculators wanted the land.
So they won, Dr. Deneen?
Legally and morally, yes. Practically, it didn't save them. Georgia continued its pressure for people to leave, and the Jackson administration did not use its federal power to make the decision meaningful. And there's an important historical correction here. You've probably heard that Jackson supposedly said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. There's no reliable evidence Jackson actually said that, We do not need an invented quotation to make this story worse. What actually happened is damning enough.
Because a constitutional right the government refuses to protect isn't much of a protection. The Cherokee used the American legal system. They won, and they still lost their country. Then came the Treaty of New Echota. This is one of the ugliest parts of the story. In December 1835, a small minority of Cherokee leaders concluded that removal was inevitable and negotiated an agreement. Only about 300 to 500 Cherokee were present, and approximately 20 men who were not designated leaders and had no right to do this signed the treaty. None of those signers, let me emphasize, were elected officials or authorized to surrender the Cherokee Nation's homeland.
And the overwhelming majority said no. Not a vague no, not an ambiguous no. More than 15,000 Cherokee eventually signed petitions opposing the treaty. By February 1838, one count recorded 15,665 Cherokee petitioners asking Congress not to enforce it. Think about that. It's a pretty big number. Roughly 16,000 people are about to be removed, and more than 15,000 names appear on petitions protesting the agreement being used to remove them.
And what's worse, the United States Senate knew the treaty was bitterly disputed. It ratified the Treaty of New Echota anyway. The margin? One vote. Think about that, my friends. The treaty, I'm almost in tears as I say this, gave the Cherokee 2 years to leave forever their eastern homeland. Most refused. They regarded the treaty as illegitimate. The United States regarded it as law. The deadline arrived in 1838.
Yeah, just imagine being told that you had to leave the home that you've known all your life. So, yeah, by then, Andrew Jackson had left office. Martin Van Buren was president. That's important because Jackson is usually identified with the Trail of Tears. That's correct in terms of the policy that led to it, but it was Van Buren's administration that carried out the mass Cherokee roundup in 1838. General Winfield Scott was assigned to oversee the operation. Federal troops and state militia moved into the Cherokee communities. More than 16,000 Cherokee men, women, and children were forced from their homes.
And forced from their homes can sound almost bureaucratic until you understand what that meant. Families could be surrounded without warning. People were taken from fields. Women were taken from their homes. Children were taken from where they were playing. Some were allowed only moments to gather possessions. Others were driven out with little more than the clothes they were wearing.
And then came the looters. National Park Service accounts describe white looters following behind the soldiers and ransacking abandoned Cherokee homes while their owners were marched away.
Just imagine seeing someone stealing your livestock, enter your house, take your belongings, perhaps occupy your farm, and knowing that the armed power of the United States is not there to protect you. It's there to remove you.
One detail sometimes disappears from popular versions of the story. People began dying before the famous Westward March even started. The Cherokee were confined in collection camps and stockades. while authorities organized the removal. The conditions were appalling, to say the least. Overcrowding, heat, contaminated water, poor sanitation, insufficient food, insufficient medicine. Disease was rampant.
One National Park Service historical report estimates that in some camps, 4 to 10 Cherokee were dying every day from heat, disease, and shortages of food and clean water. Think about what that means over weeks. A camp wakes up in the morning, someone's grandmother is dead, someone's infant is dead, someone's husband is dead. The next morning it happens again and again and again.
And diseases including whooping cough, measles, smallpox, typhus, and even tuberculosis spread through crowded removal camps. These weren't enemy combatants. These weren't criminals. They were prisoners simply because they refused to abandon their homeland voluntarily. And may I say, they weren't hurting anyone.
Absolutely not, Shannon. You're totally right. After the disastrous early removals during the summer, Cherokee leaders were permitted to take greater control of the remaining migration. Most of the large detachments began moving west in the autumn of 1838. Many traveled roughly 800 miles, although individual routes could be considerably longer. And then the weather turned against them. Heavy rain turned the roads into mud. Winter brought freezing temperatures. Rivers became difficult or impossible to cross. Food became even more scarce. Clean water could be difficult to find. At one point, large numbers of Cherokee were trapped by ice between the Ohio and the Mississippi rivers.
Yes, one removal party suffered 3 to 5 deaths a day from illness and drought. One survivor remembered losing his father, then his mother, then all 5 of his brothers and sisters, one after another. That's 7 members of one immediate family gone.
Yeah. And this is where statistics become dangerous because 4,000 can become just a number. So let's translate that. If approximately 16,000 Cherokee were subjected to removal and roughly 4,000 died as a result, that's around one person in 4. Imagine 4 members of your family standing together. Statistically, remove one. Now, do that across an entire nation. An entire nation. Think about that. Children, parents, grandparents, community leaders, teachers, farmers, craftsmen, people carrying language, people carrying traditions, family history and knowledge that just simply cannot be replaced.
We should be very careful here, ladies and gentlemen, because the famous figure of 4,000 deaths is an estimate, not a precise body count. Records are very incomplete. The National Park Service notes that more than 1,000 people died during the actual journey, while an unknown number, possibly several thousand more, died in the camps from the consequences of forced migration. A missionary physician who accompanied the Cherokee estimated total losses at more than 4,000, close to 1/5 to 1/4 of the population, depending on which population count is used.
And it makes sense. You're going to have people walking through the rain and the winter and the mud. Yeah, they're going to be deaths. This shouldn't soften the story. It should make it worse. We don't know exactly how many died because the government uprooted an entire population under conditions in which an exact accounting of the dead wasn't even preserved. Some graves were marked. Many, I think most, weren't. Families buried relatives beside roads and continued west because the detachment had to keep moving.
Yes, and there are stretches of this history where the landscape itself became the cemetery. Now, Andrew Jackson becomes the villain in the most simplified versions of the story. Is that fair, Dr. Deneen?
Partially, but it's incomplete. Jackson deserves enormous responsibility. He vigorously championed removal, even of groups that had been his allies 20 years earlier, signed the Indian Removal Act, supported Georgia in its confrontation with Cherokee sovereignty, and pushed the Treaty of New Echota toward ratification, but reducing everything to only one evil racist president actually lets too many other people escape responsibility. Congress passed a law. The Senate ratified the treaty. Georgia politicians demanded Cherokee land. State governments stripped Native people of their rights. Settlers occupied the territory. Speculators profited. Federal soldiers conducted the roundup, and Van Buren's administration completed the mass removal. And let me just say very briefly, some even stole the payment that tribal leaders were given, however minuscule it was.
That's important because atrocities rarely require an entire society to become monstrous. They require enough people to benefit, enough people to remain silent, enough people to rationalize what's happening, and enough institutions to stop saying no. And I want to return to prejudice because without it, the rest becomes very difficult to explain. The Cherokee did many of the things white America supposedly demanded of Native people. They established farms, they built schools, they adopted written laws, they created a constitution, they published a newspaper, they took disputes into American courts, they petitioned Congress, they used diplomacy, they negotiated, they even won a major Supreme Court case. And still, the United States concluded that white settlers had a greater right to Cherokee land than the Cherokee did.
And Dr. Weaver, that's the part right there that I find hardest to dismiss as simply just some disagreement over policy. When one group can own land only until another group wants it, when one nation's treaty rights count only until they become inconvenient, when one people's government is legitimate only until a state decides otherwise, and when those people can then be marched away under armed guard, then race isn't just somewhere on the edge of the story. It's near the center of it.
You got that one right.
Absolutely. And the prejudice did something psychologically useful for removal advocates. If Native Americans were portrayed as primitive, savage, doomed, or incapable of self government, childlike wards in the prejudiced language of the time, then taking their land could be presented not as theft, but as progress. God help us, removal could even be described, distorted as an act of kindness. This is one of history's most dangerous political tricks. First, dehumanize people, then claim what you're doing to them is for their own good. The Cherokee who survived reached Indian territory in what's now Oklahoma. And I want to make this clear. Survival is an important part of this story, too. They rebuilt their government. They reconstructed their communities. Tahlequah became the capital of the reestablished Cherokee Nation. Cherokees fought on both sides of the Civil War. Some Cherokee had avoided removal and remained in the East. Their descendants are associated today with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians in North Carolina.
And that matters because Native history should never end with Native people as victims. The United States inflicted extraordinary damage. It did not erase the Cherokee. The Cherokee nations survived. The language survived. The government survived. Families survived. Cultures survived too.
But survival doesn't absolve the people who caused the suffering. That's like saying a person survived an assault, so perhaps the assault wasn't quite so bad. Survival tells us something about the strength of the survivors. It doesn't reduce the guilt of the perpetrators. The Trail of Tears should trouble Americans for reasons that go beyond its death toll. This was a country that had treaties and broke them, a country with courts and failed to protect the people who successfully appealed to them, a country proclaiming liberty while forcing thousands of people from their homes at gunpoint, and a country whose leaders repeatedly described the victims as inferior while transferring their land to people considered more deserving of it.
The statistics deserve to be remembered. More than 16,000 Cherokee were forced from their eastern homeland. More than 15,000 Cherokee protested the treaty used to expel them. A treaty ratified once again, friends, by the Senate by one vote. Hundreds of miles of forced migration under appalling conditions, and approximately 4,000 dead as a consequence of removal. But behind every one of those numbers was a person.
You're exactly right, Dr. Deneen. It was someone's mother, somebody's child, someone who owned a house that another person took, someone who watched soldiers arrive, someone who saw their community disappear behind them, someone who buried a relative beside the trail and then had to keep on moving.
And maybe that's the most important thing to understand. The Trail of Tears wasn't inevitable. It wasn't a hurricane. It wasn't a famine. It wasn't an earthquake. People made decisions. Legislators voted. Presidents acted. Courts were ignored. States seized power. Soldiers followed orders. Citizens took land. And racial prejudice helped convince enough Americans that the suffering of Native American people mattered less than the ambitions of those who wanted what they possessed. That is why the Trail of Tears remains more than a tragedy. It's a warning about what can happen when prejudice, greed, political power, and indifference begin working together. So I want to thank you for joining us today. And I hope that this is as disturbing to you as it is to me. Be aware, educate yourself, look at it, see what it is. And please do come back and join us again for other episodes of Things You Don't Know. For Dr. Deneen and Chandler Foster, I hope you have a good day and that we'll see you again very soon. Bye for now.